Hello and welcome back to the Poppy Pattern channel. Have you ever looked at something and thought, I could totally make that? Because that's quite literally the only way that I look at clothing. I recently had to alter a t-shirt for my daughter because it was way too big, and I used one of her other shirts as a reference. It had these shoulder snaps, and I was like, I could totally make this. And once I did, I was like, I have to share this. I can't keep this information to myself. It's too good. It's so simple to make. You're totally welcome to just use this video as a tutorial reference if you've got a pattern or a t-shirt that you currently have and just need a little more clarification on, or you want to add snaps to it. You can totally use this video for that. Otherwise, if you don't have a pattern, shameless plug here, I have it on my Etsy shop. It has everything you need in there. The list of supplies, the tutorial, the pattern, the illustrated steps, all of it. And it pairs really nicely with this video. Okay, moving on. You zigzag stitch or serge the longer shoulder and fold over where indicated on the pattern. And once you fold it over, I like to give it a press and then top stitch that seam allowance underneath it. You top stitch through both layers, so you're catching the seam allowance underneath. Once you have that completed, you take the front bodice, lay that down correct side up, and you take the back bodice, correct sides facing each other, so the wrong side should be facing you, correct sides touching each other, and you pin and sew that shorter shoulder seam right there. I like to do a straight stitch and then zigzag stitch the seam allowance underneath. You can also use a serger, that's fine. Then I will press that seam allowance towards the back bodice. And then we move on to the neckline. Fold that neckline in half, right sides together, and stitch right along there. Fold it right side out. And I like to press this before I pin it to the bodice. That just makes it easier to work with. I'm not fighting it, and it just lays nice and flat. So once we do that, we press it, and then we pin it to the bodice. So we take that bodice, correct side up, and you pin the corner pieces to the open shoulder seams where the snaps will go. And the raw edges of the seam are both facing the correct way. And just kind of pull the fabric where you need it to go. That's the fun thing with knit fabric versus woven fabric. You can really manipulate it in a way that's easier to work with. And then you stitch right along that raw edge. The next step is optional. You can leave it as it is or do what I did and do like a 1/8 top stitch sewing the seam allowance underneath. Now we move on to the snaps. You don't need to do it this way. There's other ways to do it, but this is the method I'm using right now. I plan on buying a snap plier in the future, but I figured I would show you what I'm doing now because you don't need fancy tools. You can literally just use a hammer and a bobbin. I specifically use this one bobbin for this because I have kind of messed it up with the hammer, but whatever. So we take that snap and you can kind of see the little prongs pushing through that fabric, and you take that pokey side and you stick it right in the center of that bobbin so it has something to kind of push into. And then I like to protect my work surface by using my kitchen towel, and I just hammer one corner at a time. No, I'm not hammering my thumb, I promise. Kind of looks like it, but I'm not. So then I do a check and I make sure all of the metal pieces are pushed in. You can definitely tell if one is not because it will kind of bow outwards. And then we do the same to the back in that neckline. So we take the snap. Oh, hey, Penny. Yeah, that's my cat. We take the snaps, make sure you're using the correct sides. Your snap packet will be really helpful in this part of the process because it does show you the steps illustrated on the back. But yeah, you can just follow along. And yeah, so we just do the same thing to all of the corner pieces of the circle. That doesn't make sense, but you get what I'm trying to say. And give it a nice good hammer. And as you see, I used a silver topper on the bottom piece, and then I used a white topper. I don't have the words, I'm sorry. And now I determine where to put the middle snap. I have a reference on the pattern, but I also kind of just eyeball it because, I mean, it's slightly arbitrary. As long as it's in the center of your shoulder seam, that's fine. And just make sure it's not going into the sleeve seam allowance, because that's where you could run into an issue. So you really want it right in the center there. And you can see I kind of really gave it a nice good whack because I wanted to make sure that I was not going to run into any issues unsnapping it while she's wearing it. And then I like to baste along the armhole, that top armhole, and that helps keep it from wiggling around when you sew the sleeve into the bodice. I take one of the sleeves with the wrong side up and I fold the bottom hem up about 1/4 of an inch, and then I will press it, and then I will sew right along that seam allowance. And I did a zigzag stitch because that's what I wanted to do. You could probably do a straight stitch, but on knitwear, especially with the armhole, I would recommend doing a zigzag. It just helps keep it from the thread breaking. And then you repeat the same step to the other sleeve. Just make sure the wrong side is up when you're doing this. Just do a quick double check before you do it. And then you move those off to the side, take your bodice, lay it flat. And this part's a little tricky because you're working with two opposite circles, which is always intimidating. But with knit fabric, just remember you can stretch it as you're going, and it is a lot more forgiving than you give it credit for. So what I did is I pinned the two underarm corners first, and then I took the center of the top sleeve and pinned it to the center of the top armhole. And then you just manipulate the fabric and make it work for you. That sounds easier said than done sometimes, but for this pattern, I promise it's very simple because it's pretty even. You don't have to worry about, like with woven fabric, there's like ease, and that's just not fun. So with this knit fabric, you don't have to worry about that. And then you sew along that armhole. I also like to zigzag so that way it finishes off the seam and reinforces it, especially with it being an armhole. Then you do the same thing to the other sleeve. This one I pinned a little differently. I think this might be easier. I don't know. There's a million ways to do the same thing. So I decided to do both ways. So yeah, we did the center and then I did the two ends, and then I worked on manipulating everything inside of that. Once you have that done, we move on to sewing the side seams together. We pin with the correct sides together, starting at the top and bottom, and then the underarm seam. So those are the 3 points that you want to match up. And then everything in the middle, you just make it work. You just, get it going. And then using directional sewing, start at the wrist and then go down towards the hem. I did that first stitch and then I did the zigzag stitch, and then we do the same thing to the other side, starting by matching the wrist seam, the underarm seam, and the hem seam. And then using directional sewing, you go from the wrist down to the hem, just like I showed you before, and we do that straight stitch and then the zigzag stitch. And then the final step is your bottom hem of the bodice. You do it exactly the same way that you do the wrist or you can do it different. That's totally designer's choice, but I chose to do it the same way. Folding it up 1/4 of an inch and zigzag stitch along the bottom. Sometimes that bottom edge can come out a little bit warped. If you use a lot of steam from your iron, that will help clean that up and make it look less homemade, I guess. And there you have it. You have your baby tee with snaps at the shoulder so you can actually put it over your kid's head. I made this pattern from size newborn all the way up to 1 year because I don't know yet if a 2-year-old's noggin is too big to fit through a t-shirt or not. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Go ahead and like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.